What is a moral dilemma?
A moral dilemma occurs when we have moral obligations to others, and they exist on both sides of a choice. And if we perform or refrain from one, then one side is going to lose. Contrast that with a practical dilemma, where we have a choice between two or more alternatives, both of which appear to be obligatory or desirable. The decision maker here is caught in a bind. They are caught between alternatives because circumstances prevent him or her from doing both things. A moral dilemma occurs in circumstances when moral appeals based on values cross one another, and one cannot act without infringing upon one or more principles or values.
What characterizes a moral dilemma?
Moral dilemmas can occur in two different ways. They can occur within a person, what we call intrapersonal, or they can occur between two or more people, which we call the interpersonal. So I may have a moral dilemma that I need to figure out for myself, which is an example of an intrapersonal moral dilemma. Or I can get into an argument with other people, and we may all be making moral claims to a particular action, and that would be an example of an interpersonal dilemma. Intrapersonal ones arouse powerful emotions in us, such as anxiety, fear, and anger. Interpersonal conflicts often feature differences in status and power. For instance, some patients and family members feel powerless in front of clinicians, and they may not speak at all. It is really up to clinicians to recognize this and use their power in a very just way and be very inclusive in communicating with patients such that they can engage in shared decision-making.
Why are emotions important?
If you have listened to podcasts episode 1 and 2, you will know that emotions are important in resolving moral dilemmas, and they are a key element in the moral life. To summarize, we need feelings, and feelings need to be heated in order to engage in moral problem solving. Without the capacity to even feel conflicting emotions and obligations, we may fail to even realize a moral dilemma exists at all. We may sidestep the entire process altogether and infringe on someone else's moral boundaries. The capacity to empathize with another person, to put yourself in the other's place, is really needed to be moral. We need to be able to see the other person in what they are going through. To allow oneself to feel conflicting emotions and conflicting obligations invites a state of moral ambiguity or uncertainty. This is a normal stage in the process of responding to a genuine ethical problem. What we typically don't want to do here is to leave things at the emotional level, where we shoot from the hip or have an emotional reaction. This short-circuits the process of ethical deliberation.
How can you frame a moral problem?
It's very important, as we said, to take that moral dilemma that you really feel and describe it as an ethical problem that needs to be solved. The way that the clinical pragmatism framework suggests that we do this is that we hypothesize answers to sidestep the moral dilemma. That's all part of the moral diagnosis in step 2 of the clinical pragmatism framework. Now, the word problem has two meanings in Greek, and both understandings help to see how the clinical pragmatism framework can frame a moral dilemma in terms of an ethical problem to be solved. The first way that the Greeks understood the word problem comes from the word problema, which is basically an obstacle. And in this way, dilemmas stop us in our path, and they disrupt patient care. We need to be able to solve them. The other sense of the word in Greek is the verb probein, which is to throw forward. This points to the human ability to take a step beyond or deeper than the initial experience of a dilemma as an obstacle. In very much the same way, what we do is we throw forward in the sense of hypothesizing. We make a projection about what the ethical problem is and how we might be able to solve it. In this way, the two senses that the Greeks have for the word problem helps us understand how we should go and engage a moral dilemma as an ethical problem.
What are the most frequently faced clinical moral dilemmas?
Clinicians face a variety of moral dilemmas, but the ones that most frequently arise are the cases that require or seem to require clinicians' infringements on basic obligations to patients. Examples here might include the prima facie duty that a clinician has to keep patient information confidential or private, There may be certain circumstances where breaching that confidentiality or privacy could benefit an imperiled third party or could help save a patient from causing himself or others harm. There may be certain circumstances where the clinician feels that they have to infringe on a basic obligation to a patient in order to do good by them. Other disputes arise in choices and diagnosis or treatments at various stages and circumstances of the life cycle. The beginning of life, the middle of life, and the end of life. So it's all cradle to grave when it comes to ethical issues.
What are the ethical principles clinicians can use?
This is the so-called Georgetown mantra, the 4 ethical principles that are relevant sources of general ethical guidance. They're so named because the 2 prominent scholars in bioethics, who were from Georgetown, wrote one of the seminal textbooks in bioethics. The 4 principles are very important and can help describe the duties that clinicians have, but they shouldn't be used as absolute terms for moral decision-making. The first ethical principle is beneficence. This creates an obligation that clinicians have to benefit their patients and other persons and to further their welfare and interests. The second concerns respect for patients' autonomy. This obligates clinicians to protect and defend the informed choices of patients that are capable to make these decisions. Non-maleficence is related to beneficence. This asserts an obligation that we should try to prevent harm, or if the risks of harm must be taken, to minimize them. The fourth principle concerns justice. This is a relevant consideration on fairness to access to health care and to issues of rationing at the bedside. Each of these will be considered in turn when talking about the clinical pragmatism framework, which is part of our next episode.
What are the duties and obligations of clinicians?
After the clinician-patient relationship is established, the following obligations are morally binding. The first is that the patient should be assured privacy and have a process that maintains their confidentiality. So the clinician should respect their privacy and ensure that their private information remains that way. The second concern is that clinicians have to communicate honestly about all aspects of the patient's diagnosis, treatment, and prognosis. The third is that clinicians should determine if the patient is capable of sharing in decision-making. If not, they need to go to a surrogate decision-maker. The fourth concerns informed consent. Clinicians have the obligation to conduct an ethically sound process of informed consent throughout the relationship to ensure that the patient or the patient surrogate has a clear understanding of what is going to be required in their treatment.